For the longest time, I've been obsessed with unreleased games. Titles which are too many to count, which have been abandoned, unreleased, or just left in a conceptual state of mind. But the one that's fascinated me more than any other game is Castlevania Resurrection, which is a title that would have continued Sonia Belmont's legacy left off from Castlevania Legends. And the, at the time, producer of Castlevania, Koji Igarashi, unfortunately retconned her portion of her story. Today, we'll be digging deep into the legacy that Sonia Belmont left for us, which is Castlevania Legends on the Game Boy, as well as digging up the grave of the very first member of the Belmont clan. Yes, that's right, kids. I'm going to be literally digging up the grave of the very first Belmont, Sonia. Let's go, kids! Castlevania Legends, also known as Akomajo Dracula Dark Knight Prelude, was a Game Boy exclusive released for Japanese markets in 1997 and Western shores in 1998. Created by a subsidiary company of Konami called Konami Computer Entertainment Nagoya, this division was responsible for not only the Japan-exclusive Sega Saturn port of Symphony of the Night, but also bringing Sonia Belmont to life with Legends. As the final entry in the Game Boy era Castlevania series, is this retconned game worth taking up the vampire killer whip for old time's sake? Or was Igarashi right to bury this legendary tale? We begin the game by either picking from a standard or light mode. Basically, the major difference is that light mode allows your whip to be powered up right from the get-go. It's a nice introduction for players not accustomed to the franchise, though truth be told, this is the easiest of the three mainline Castlevania Game Boy experiences. So the easier mode, while friendlier to casual or new players, isn't recommended for Castlevania and platforming game aficionados. Plus, with a password option in the game, coming back to the level where you left off is always an option. We are given a brief synopsis into Sonia's plight, to rid the land of Transylvania of the madness and death caused by Dracula and his minions. It's up to her to defeat Dracula and restore peace to the land. It's a pretty simple concept that has stood the test of time for the series. Dracula bad, Belmont's good. But later in the game, we do get a little bit more detail into a certain featured character. But before we dive into timelines, legacies and such, let's get to the wall meat and potatoes of this review. Okay, bad joke. Yo, I'm not sorry. Castlevania Legends is comprised of about 5 stages, with the 5th stage having 2 parts to it, and a bonus dungeon area thrown in as well. You'll travel between the quintessential spooky graveyards, castle hallways, clock towers, as well as cathedrals and dungeons, all on your quest to hunt down and destroy good old Drac himself. Control is surprisingly solid here as compared to Castlevania the Adventure and Castlevania II Belmont's Revenge. Sonia has upgraded movement when it comes to jumping, allowing her movement while in midair. The added maneuverability is certainly welcome after 2 Game Boy games of rigid jumping mechanics. I'd also state that Sonia moves much faster than Christopher Belmont from the previous games, making the game more in line with the NES releases. However, she's also equipped with a slow crawl, which was a nice addition to movement through tight spaces. I'll always have a soft spot for stiff platformers in the old school Castlevania style. However, I still prefer seeing these games advance their mechanics over time. Overall, I'm happier with movement in this game as compared with previous entries. Speaking of advancing, going through the first level, you'll notice 2 things. The first is that this level is agonizingly long. It just seems to go on forever, which is odd because the rest of the levels feel a bit more average in length as compared with previous games in the franchise. The second is that you're not picking up any sub-weapons like the traditional axes, boomerang crosses, holy water, or daggers. The reason for this is because Legends steals from Mega Man's playbook by rewarding you secondary attacks after beating an enemy. There are a total of 5 different soul weapons that Sonia can collect, including a wind attack which stops time? An ice spell which, for whatever reason, refills your life bar, a flame attack which kills basic enemies, a projectile spell called Saint, as well as, magic? which appears to clear the screen of enemies. Seems like kind of a generic name. Couldn't they have named it anything else? Each of these abilities utilizes hearts, with the health refill being the highest amount, which is 20 per use. And, oddly enough, it always seemed like level 1 had way more hearts to grab than later levels. I love the concept of beating bosses to gain abilities, but I feel like they could have gone a step farther by having these abilities apply to normal sub-weapons that should have been in the game. Can you imagine applying a fire elemental spell to an axe throw? Or an ice dagger? Maybe a wind spell that actually does something involving wind. It just seems like such a lost opportunity for Konami. There's also another attack that can be performed once per life called Burning Mode. Press A and B together at the same time invokes Sonia to, make her digital giblets glow? With the power of pixelated chesticles, Sonia is now twice as fast and can jump greater distances as well. However, the real game changer here is invulnerability during this short time period. There's nothing stopping you from working through the level without using it, only to make boss battles insanely easy to blow through. Because of this, I'd like to call it Baby's First Castlevania. There's almost no challenge to any of the truly difficult parts of the game where you can just spam the attack button while standing right on top of a major enemy. While this kills the challenge, it doesn't kill the fun factor in playability. Most of the platforming in this game is pretty average for Castlevania, but I kind of felt like the level design here was either too spacious or too cramped, depending on the level. For example, the clock tower felt constricted to move in at points, whereas the graveyard felt way too open-ended. Level length feels a bit unbalanced and confusing, especially towards the end when it gets harder to tell what is a branching path to advance the level or to pick up secret items. Branching paths seem to be less about replayability and more focused on finding hidden items. In previous games in the series, if you collected a 1-up, it did not respawn each time you die. However, Sonia can die without having to worry about missing the 1-up, as long as she doesn't pass the checkpoint in the level, along with unlimited continues that put you back at checkpoints instead of the beginning of a level, and of course, the burning mode. The game tries to challenge players in other ways by making the game focus on grabbing special hidden items in certain spots of each level. As far as I know, there are only 2 endings in this game, but honestly, I only ever got the best ending. This is achieved by locating sub-weapons. Wait, what? Well, that seems backwards. The dagger, cross boomerang, holy water, axe, and pocket watch are all spread out throughout the levels, 1 per level, and it's up to Sonia to uncover them all. What I'm thinking, and again, this is all off the top of my head, so it's obviously not canon, but maybe she had to bless these items somehow with the soul weapons in order to make them useful for future generations of Belmonts? That would kinda make sense. Graphically, Legends has some very impressive graphics when it comes to the sprites and backgrounds. Some enemies felt a little simplistic looking at points, with most of the regular enemies being less detailed than Belmont's Revenge. However, I'd say the bosses were larger sprites this time around with richer visuals. Backgrounds are a mixed bag, with some popping out more than usual, but other parts feel a little barren. I'd also argue that the biggest focus was on delivering the cinematic art style that mirrored the at-the-time recently released masterpiece, Castlevania Symphony of the Night. Alucard makes an appearance here, and his artwork in the cutscenes is right out of that classic game. I actually really enjoyed the dialogue between Alucard and Sonia, and eventually Sonia and Dracula. Well, most of it. It felt like there was more at stake than previous entries, mostly because of the exposition on previous Castlevania titles being a bit lacking. But the tone here is very melodramatic and B-movie-ish, which I certainly don't have a problem with, but I can understand others being upset about that. Considering Castlevania has always been a series that parodied Hammer horror films, Universal monster movies, with a mix of Japanese wackiness, I typically really enjoy the corny lines. The first time I heard this warped version of Bloody Tears, I thought to myself, ugh, there will always only be one true version of that song, the one in Simon's Quest. But the rest of the soundtrack is actually really great, full of classical Baroque era fused with the hard rock and metal styled music. There were a few tracks on this soundtrack which really surprised me. With music and sound effects by Kaoru Okada and Yoichi Iwata, I was prepared to throw shade against this soundtrack, but in the end, I actually loved it. Some of the tracks are more Mega Man inspired than Castlevania, but the tone and tempo mixed with the neoclassical flair really makes it work. As I said earlier, the bosses in this game are a breeze here. Heck, even Dracula was easier than in other Castlevania games. If you collected all the special items, you're left with an obligatory ending with Sonia holding a baby, clearly a nod to the next Belmont chronologically, who would be Trevor, Ralph,
Trevor, but it's Ralph. You know who I mean. This left a lot of gamers scratching their heads as the previous cutscenes, along with the manual, insinuate that Alucard is the father of this child, which explains why producer Koji Igarashi planned out the official timeline by retconning several titles, including Legends. Igarashi shifted a lot of the late 90s and early 2000s games which were not actually involving Igarashi in any way. Many fans are torn on this, as the games that were nixed left gaps in the timeline that were easily explainable. Hold on to your Medusa heads, folks, because we're about to get super nerdy. See, if Sonia's timeline remained intact, Legends, taking place in 1450 AD, would have been chronologically the first Castlevania game in the series, followed by Castlevania III Dracula's Curse in 1476, putting Ralph, this guy, at about 26 years old, which makes sense in this aspect. Alucard would rise to battle his father with his son, his future daughter-in-law Saifa Belnades, and Grant Dynasty. Yes, I said Dynasty, deal with it. But Castlevania Lament of Innocence technically throws a huge boomerang cross into the gears of logic, since the vampire killer is created from the soul of Leon Belmont's ex-fiancée, Sarah. However, does this mean Sonia's story shouldn't exist within the timeline? If we take a look at the franchise overall, you'll see Belmonts growing in power, with Richter and arguably Julius being the most powerful. Was this because their blood was fused with Dracula's lineage? After all, it is canon that Dracula's wife Lisa gave birth to Alucard, so wouldn't that mean if Sonia, a powerful human woman, and Alucard, half vampire, half human, created what is arguably the true Belmont lineage? And with no games chronologically between Lament of Innocence and Legends, why destroy a potentially huge narrative plot twist, as well as a reference to later titles involving direct lineage offshoots? In Castlevania Bloodlines and Castlevania Portrait of Ruin, we see the Morris boys taking over for the Belmonts, with the ability to wield the vampire killer whip being passed down to them. And since they're directly descendants of Quincy Morris from Bram Stoker's Dracula novel, it's all but confirmed that Stoker's novel is actually part of the timeline. So wouldn't it make more sense if Dracula was weak against his own flesh and blood? Shortly after Castlevania Legends was released, the Sega Dreamcast was the next big system that was supposedly meant to usher gamers into the new millennium. While companies like Capcom released a ton of titles for the machine, there were other companies, such as Konami, who didn't have faith in the potential of the Dreamcast. Konami was usually hesitant to put their Castlevania franchise on Sega systems outside of Castlevania Bloodlines, as well as the arguably botched Japanese exclusive Sega Saturn port of Symphony of the Night. But despite this, they decided to announce a brand new entry in the series exclusively for the Sega Dreamcast. However, the era that this was worked on was the same time as Castlevania 64 and Legacy of Darkness, which were both panned by plenty of fans. Wouldn't you know it, Igarashi did not work on either of these titles, and both were considered alternate universes and not part of Iga's timeline. That brings us to the Dreamcast and the game that never was, Castlevania Resurrection. In 1999, Konami announced the 17th entry into the Castlevania series. I remember being a devout reader of EGM at the time, and when I saw this article, I flipped out. I had never owned a Sega console, and I missed out on Castlevania Bloodlines' launch, because I was a devout Nintendo fanboy at the time. But I couldn't let another Castlevania title slip through my fingers. I made a decision that day. I was going to own the Sega Dreamcast. Shortly after the launch of the console, I bought a Sega Dreamcast for one game. Now, that didn't stop me from having a blast with my Dreamcast eventually, but I was constantly checking online websites for news of Sonia Belmont's return, only to find out shortly afterwards that I was in for a big surprise, one that I wasn't going to like. In March 2000, Konami announced that Castlevania Resurrection was cancelled, the same month as the Sony PlayStation 2's Japanese release. By this point, both Castlevania 64 and Legacy of Darkness had released to mixed results from critics and fans. The transition into 3 dimensions was unkind to a lot of franchises, but Castlevania seemed to struggle quite a bit with platforming and camera control issues. So, was it truly the result of the PlayStation 2's launch that killed Resurrection? And what kind of game would Resurrection have been? Castlevania Resurrection would tell the tale of both Sonia Belmont and Victor Belmont in a time-traveling adventure the likes of which Castlevania would have never seen. Victor Belmont, from the 1800s, decided to forego following in his family's footsteps and becoming a vampire slayer. Somehow, Sonia Belmont would have been brought into the future to take on the evils of Dracula's castle and stop not only Dracula, but female Dracula? The implied idea of having a vampire killer legend and one who wants to forget that legacy is a smart and interesting idea that I would have loved to see in action. Would you be able to change from Sonia to Victor on a whim? It seemed like we were always seeing screenshots of Sonia, so it was implied that Sonia was the star of the game, with Victor having an occasional part of the action, but obviously this was very unclear. So how would this game have played? Resurrection was supposedly going to have between 5 and 6 very long levels, and with 2 playable characters. It's unknown if this would increase the replay value of the game or not. Several unlockable costumes were showcased online long after the cancellation by artist Greg Orduyan. It also seemed like there would be a bigger focus on more bosses and puzzles, with enemies themselves not looking as simplistic bad guys, but mini-bosses unto themselves, combined with a more linear style adventure that harkens back to the classic titles instead of the sprawling castles of Symphony of the Night. Resurrection was ambitious in every aspect. Seeing this game back in the day, and recently revisiting the photos and trailer, graphically I was either blown away at Resurrection, or I thought it looked a bit janky when it came to the still images. Back then, you kinda had to see games in motion to truly appreciate the three-dimensional aspect. However, the game is said to be much more impressive visually speaking according to IGN staff at the time. I feel like Resurrection would have nailed the atmosphere and visual aesthetic of the series. There were supposedly sub-weapons along with a charge shot option for both your whip and sub-weapon. This is an interesting combat mechanic I would have loved to see more of in motion. The team that was handling this title was Konami USA under the supervision of Castlevania Bloodlines and Sunset Riders designer Norio Takamoto. This branch had supposedly fixed a lot of issues that Castlevania 64 and Legacy of Darkness had when it came to 3D action, with the initial E3 1999 build looking a bit rough. However, IGN had reportedly seen the November 1999 build of the game, which was looking much more impressive. Takamoto was a self-pronounced fan of the series, similar to Koji Igarashi, and Resurrection was Takamoto's attempt to have the USA Konami branch succeed in the West. When Resurrection was cancelled for Dreamcast, it was rumored that the PlayStation 2 was the largest reason for cancellation, but it's also been said that there was a bit of disagreement between the West and East branches of Konami regarding the game's progress. It was rumored that the assets made their way back to Japan and they were worked on by Konami's Kobe branch, you know, the guys who made Castlevania 64 and Legacy of Darkness. However, they supposedly scrapped the project shortly afterwards, deciding to start over, with assets rumored to have been used in Castlevania Curse of Darkness on the PlayStation 2. With the Dreamcast and Castlevania Resurrection's demise, Koji Igarashi took full control of the franchise, with his next mission to create an all-new origin story for the Castlevania series. Personally, I've always found Lament of Innocence's story jarring when it came to Dracula's origins, but that's a topic for another video. It's been said that Koji Igarashi was against the idea of a female protagonist fighting vampires in ancient times, which I guess I can understand from an ancient Japan stereotype, but he seemed to not have a problem with Sypha Belnades, who was playable in his supposedly favorite entry of the series, Castlevania III Dracula's Curse. So, what gives? Why the hate on Sonia? Sadly, Sonia Belmont's legacy is defined in failure. Castlevania Legends didn't sell too well, for it was released in one of the last years of the Game Boy's life cycle, shortly before the Game Boy Color was released, and Resurrection's intent on bringing her back from the dead had failed as well. I'll always wonder what happened, what could have been, and why we potentially missed out on a game that could have been a huge saving grace to the idea that Castlevania doesn't work that well in 3D. I enjoyed my time with Castlevania Legends. I just wish the game was harder in order to quench the difficulty bloodlust I've enjoyed over the years with the older entries of the series. Speaking of Resurrection, there was a beta for that game that supposedly sold for about 3,000 euros, but nobody knows who the buyer was, nor has the beta been released to the public. Fans have done a lot to keep Sonia in Castlevania's history, including fan remixes of tracks from Legend, new fan art, as well as even creating new game concept ideas for new Sonia Belmont adventures. Perhaps one day, we'll be able to see what could have been Sonia's resurrection.
After a couple hours of digging, I have found it. I have found Sonia Belmont. I can't believe this. They were right. They were right exactly where they said she'd be buried. I have so many questions, so many wonders, so many
inquiries. I just, maybe if I get a little closer, I can get some answers.
If I told you fanboys once, I told you 1,000 times. Leave me.
Thank you to the following patrons. Your support means the world to me. Want more Dude You Haven't Played This Game? Make sure to stay subscribed to the channel and check out these videos enclosed below. As always, thanks for watching.